dude, get that thing away from me. No, stop.
Radio Free Innsmouth episode 217, back to extreme metal, back to death metal, talking about a band that when I say the name, it'll probably make your eyes roll, especially if you got into death metal around when I did, like the early to mid 2000s.
You know what I'm saying? Like
Vital Remains.
I know what you're thinking.
Jub, I bought that album when I was like 14, and the hottest bands out there were Nile and Necrophagist and Anata and whatnot. They got hyped all over the place because it had the crazy fucking neoclassical solos. And it was super fast and brutal and had Glenn Benton on vocals, way after a lot of people stopped caring about Glenn Benton's other band, Deicide. Why the hell are you bringing this dinosaur metal band up, dude? Nobody's thought about these guys in years.
Listen, fuckhead!
Referring to Vital Remains simply as that other band that Glenn Benton from Deicide was in.
This is big mistake.
Because not only did Glenn not write any of the music for this band, but they have a big, long history going back to way before he was ever doing guest vocals in the band. And if you ask me, that's where the good stuff lies. And that's why this is one of the most criminally underrated death metal bands of all time. But speaking of Deicide, if you're familiar with Deicide at all, you're probably thinking, that was Glenn Benton back in that music sample? It barely even sounded like him. It definitely sounded like he didn't write the vocal patterns of the lyrics or anything, because usually when you're talking about Deicide, the vocal patterns in that are almost like another musical instrument. In his main band, he's very strategic with where he places his different satanic outbursts, using the vocals to kind of drive the music. His vocal patterns are synced almost exactly to the guitars, and in many ways, it's sort of the driving force of what's making the music go forward. He also gets much more theatrical with like vocal layering. He puts in lots of weird shrieky bits, doubled up vocals, and once again they follow the guitars almost exactly. They sort of provide a bit of counterpoint to them. In many ways, he's a very melodic vocalist despite the fact that he's, just growling and stuff. It's not like what he does in Vital Remains at all. In that, he more just kind of sings across the music. For real, that could be anybody doing that. Speaking of underrated bands, this is going to sound really wacky, but I think Deicide is kind of underrated nowadays. It seems like there's a lot of people that just listen to death metal that probably shouldn't be. Like, I don't know why they do. And these sorts of people tend to really turn their nose up at older bands like Deicide. Stay tuned for my eventual episode of Radio Free Innsmouth where I go insane and defend the widely maligned Deicide album Incinerate Him as actually being pretty darn good.
This is my impersonation of my trolls. Because they're retarded.
The point is, the music of Deicide really does not have much to do with the music of Vital Remains. Having said that, the very early Vital Remains demos actually do sound a little bit like Deicide. Mainly due to the guitar playing style, which is very thrashy, punchy, percussive riffs, and very short, explosive death metal songs. It was a pretty heavy compositional debt to Slayer, particularly with these sort of transitions. You get the one guitar going and the other one hitting percussive notes going in. But it's right here that you can sort of see them becoming more unique as well, because it has this weird Morbid Angel-esque lurching quality to it that wasn't really part of Deicide. Deicide was like always very solid. Morbid Angel was always kind of like very liquidy, if that makes sense. Vital Remains would expand on that dichotomy with their later demos that kind of went up right to before their first album came out. And they would also add a whole bunch of atmosphere, like very spooky atmospheric touches. Boom!
Haunted house!
And it's when they started doing that they developed their own very unique style of death metal. Songs from this era might start with a really strong ostinato riff such as this that then leads into a full stop followed by like a very churning sort of like weird groovy riff. Here's another new element of the sound that really picks up around now. The incredible lead guitar. It's not quite a solo, it's more just like this extra weird little melody thing, and it's typically very suspenseful and dark, which will then transition into like a whole other section. These songs are typically very long and complex. There's also quite a bit of black metal to this. In fact, back in the day, these guys were considered one of the first American black metal bands, depending on who you asked. There actually was attempts to create sort of like a festival for black metal bands from the U.S. in particular that was going to have Vital Remains, Order from Chaos, Grand Belial's Key, and Profanatica. Unfortunately, it never ended up happening. But yeah, nowadays we would just call this death metal, probably not black metal. But the fact remains that they were obviously moving in a much weirder and more black metal adjacent direction with their music. And that really came into flowering on their first full-length album, which is my personal favorite of the bunch, entitled Let Us Pray. When it comes to this album,
it's the most fun you can possibly have.
It's honestly one of the greatest old school death metal albums. Some people might get scared away looking at the song lengths, but
okay, here's the thing.
If you were to open that song as a waveform, you can see how many peaks and valleys and how all over the place it is. You can actually see how many sections each song has just looking at the waveform. So they clearly earn those long song lengths with some very complex and interesting songwriting. And that's why I love this album. The drums are much less blasting this time around. It's more rolling and atmospheric, and the guitars do a lot of cool stuff like that. Each riff has like all these different sort of like component parts to them that you can then like switch around bits of and have them end in all sorts of weird ways. There's kind of a little bit of Candlemass going on here with the rolling double bass and the little intrusions of melody. Like that. Also, there's pretty prominent atmospheric keyboards that weren't really a feature of Vital Remains that much before this album, but they're definitely important here. Big atmospheric touches like that help make this unique. Also, this part's brutal. Check out what he says here. That was 3 death metal dies. You gotta have the part in every old school death metal song where the vocalist just goes, die! It's very important. But what's even more important for death metal to be like good death metal is amazing rhythm guitar. And Tony Lazzaro, the main songwriter, it's always kind of been his baby, this band, delivers that in spades. With these just really weird chugging, churning riffs that sound like nobody else in the business. And of course, all the cool little like melodic interlude parts. This is what I mean by multi-part riffs. They'll start out and then have a weird little melodic tail to them. And you can kind of switch around each of those components to lead into new sections of riffs a little bit more gradually. And that is what enables you to have 9-minute long death metal songs that don't get boring. And that's why this album is great. It's basically perfect. And it's a damn shame that literally nobody fucking talks about this album. The follow-up to it is even more under-recognized, Into Cold Darkness. This one's kind of interesting because they sort of moved away from like the super long songs a bit, and you would think it'd be going back to like the style of their demos, but even though the songs are shorter, they're still written in that classic, uniquely Vital Remains style from the first album. They just have more modern drumming and faster speeds to them. But yeah, they got the full stops that they got. They got all those like weird change-ups, and the songs have like a whole bunch of riffs crammed into them, a whole lot of like different dynamic sections going on. And it keeps that sort of almost black metal feeling going with a lot of the atmosphere, particularly during the harsher tremolo pick sections like the one you're hearing now. These songs all have a very impressive sense of narrative to them. Moving into a little bit more of a mid-paced section here, that's always been sort of the trademark of this era of Vital Remains. With those heavy guitar hits that are linked up exactly with the drums. And him yelling cool shit over it because it's death metal and we like that. All in all, I still kind of prefer the first album just because it had that really unique and startling style of songwriting, very atypical for death metal at the time. However, there is one song on the second Vital Remains album that actually does continue wholesale that super atmospheric shit they were doing on the first album. And it happens to be the first song on the second album. That continues the classic Vital Remains trick of starting out a song with like a very startling and abrupt death metal riff. The drumming, obviously, is a little bit more modern death metal sounding, as I intimated earlier. But yeah, then there's a full stop into the churning shit, okay? That's classic Vital Remains type stuff. And the lead guitar on this one is particularly outstanding. It's those same weird, winding, dissonant, melodic parts. And the atmosphere with the keyboards and the cool like timpanis right here. Okay, that's perfect. Mwah, chef's kiss. Awesome death metal album. So you think it'd be all going amazing for Vital Remains at this point, but it wasn't, because they were signed at this label called Peaceville, or at least an imprint of it. I think they were on like Def or something. And Peaceville lost their American distribution in the mid-90s, which meant it was very hard to get your Dark Throne albums and your Autopsy albums and all that. Reading the winds of change, Tony Lazzaro and company decided to sign to Osmos for the next two albums. But there was some other shakeups going on. Jeff Grusland, the original vocalist who was one of the founding members, ended up leaving. They ameliorated this potential pitfall by simply having Joe Lewis, the bassist, switch to doing bass and vocals. But they had another problem where they didn't really have like a steady drummer. They ended up hiring this guy named David Suzuki, and this ended up being very important for Vital Remains because it came in just doing drums. He ended up also doing all of the lead guitar, a lot of the bass playing, and contributing substantially to the songwriting. So they did two albums kind of in this style. They were called Forever Underground and Dawn of the Apocalypse. They're both really good. Of my, the two of my favorites, probably Forever Underground. And you would think, okay, they have like new songwriting coming in, new drummer, some new lead guitar playing. Are they going to keep changing even more? Yes, they do, but not in the way you would expect. What they actually ended up doing on Forever Underground, you can tell just by looking at the lengths of the songs. They ended up bringing back that songwriting style from the first album with the really long song lengths, tons of sections in each song, all those like cool little atmospheric things, which is probably why Forever Underground is my second favorite Vital Remains after the first album. All of the first four are amazing though. You should get all of them if you like this sort of weird death metal. There's another awesome like full stop transition, very abrupt, despite, the music kind of being a little bit more subtle than you would expect in death metal. Into some thrash! Death thrash. Very good death thrash with a whole lot of like weird black metal spookiness to it. They're fond of using these weird sort of like throw the guitarist down the stairs kind of riffs to transition to new sections of music. That's pretty fucking black metal. So here's where we're going to get into that more subtle sort of songwriting that I was talking about. Because you've had this riff going for a minute, they're going to modify it where they really like parse out that weird floaty lead guitar, and then your right channel rhythm guitar gets a whole lot more chugging and simple. That's interesting stuff. And then they bring the keyboard phrase back from earlier. They give it this new little sort of counterpoint riff, sort of communicating between these two parts across the song. That is called good death metal songwriting. This part right here is kind of interesting because it's probably the closest they get to standard sort of old school death metal stuff, but it's leading into one of the things that make this album unique amongst death metal records. Very avant-garde coming up right here. This cool little very orchestral transition. You can imagine a guy hitting timpanis in an army drum band. And this is when we move into all of the Dave Suzuki songwriting away from the Tony Lazzaro stuff, because he's a pretty wacky guy when it comes to death metal. He incorporates all this odd, like, acoustic guitar stuff, a whole lot of atmospherics, and even when he gets into, like, the distorted type guitar solos, he still has this, like, neoclassical flair to it that's very out of the ordinary for the genre, especially at the time. He's not really like a shredder type guitarist. He's more of just a guy that likes to do these really cool like melodies. And he's playing drums at the same time. Amazing musician, alright? Very multi-talented sort of fella. And they would continue to run with that for pretty much all the albums that have come out since then. The newer albums, like the last two, the ones that everybody's heard, they're okay. Like they're very impressive the first time you listen to them, but then you realize it's kind of more like ear candy-ish. Like, oh, there's cool like shreddy solos. The drumming's really fast. The songs are really long. There's Glenn Benton from Deicide. But what makes Vital Remains an amazing band for me is the first four albums that I have talked about here, particularly Forever Underground and Let Us Pray. If you want to hear some of what the best death metal has to offer, get those two at least. And probably In Cold Darkness too, that's a good one. And even Dawn of the Apocalypse. Since then, it's kind of been a rough road for Vital Remains. David Suzuki ended up leaving. They've had a whole lot more member shakeups since then. They've had like multiple people that came into the band end up dying. Maybe someday there will be a new Vital Remains album. And if there is, I'm gonna listen to it at least once because I really like me a whole lot of their discography. And hopefully you did too. Even if you didn't, thanks for listening to the episode. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.
I know you drive a salvage V6 Mustang, and you're lazy. And you're also unemployed at 40 years old, and you eat Wendy's. And you do tax fraud. You're an idiot, my friend.